I'm Amber Nicholson. I'm the Assistant Director of the Health Professions Advising Center at UC Riverside, and I'll be joined today by a colleague, Dr. Jennifer Kavetsky from the Academic Resource Center, and we'll be spending the next 90 minutes going through those three application narratives that I just mentioned: personal statement, work and activity section, and disadvantage statement. Jen and I like to start off with a disclaimer before getting too deep into this session because writing is a really subjective and personal process. For a lot of people, that is why writing a personal statement might be so uncomfortable because it is such a subjective process. So, over the next 90 minutes or so together, you are going to hear my opinion and Dr. Kavetsky's opinion and suggestions for students who are looking for some practical approaches to crafting their essays. Um, that's not to say that if you have come into this session with a very clear idea of how you want to approach your personal statement, or you are a type of writer who really gravitates more to the creative writing, imagery type style of a personal statement, and you're comfortable in that zone, that's great. That's not wrong. That's just not the approach that we're going to take today. We're going to take what we would call more of a practical approach, as if this was mirroring maybe like even a job application process. So to get started, it's helpful to be mindful of what a personal statement is and even sometimes what it's not. And I think the personal statement or the personal part of personal statement is where that can be somewhat confusing for applicants. This essay is designed to get to know you beyond your academic transcripts or your MCAT score. It's to help understand your life story. You know, how did you initially become interested in medicine? What have you done to explore and confirm you're interested in medicine? What does your future profession look like? That kind of three-part model of where have you been, where are you now, and where are you going is going to be a major theme that you're going to hear me say many times. Like, what was the spark that lit your match? How did you explore and confirm your interest in medicine? And where is your future going to take you? That's really kind of the purpose of your personal statement, is to share that why medicine or why dentistry or why pharmacy piece. You all need to be mindful of is, did you read the prompt? Do you have a clear understanding of what is being asked of you? And this is particularly important when you get to secondary applications, which we're not going to talk about today because that's so kind of far down the pipeline. But when you get to a secondary application, it's going to be a very specific question about like your interest or aptitude for a particular school or program. For all health professions, you guys go into a common app or a centralized application system, which oftentimes we call CAS, like AMCAS or ACOMAS, right? That CAS is a centralized application system. And that essay is going to go to all different types of med schools or dental schools or pharmacy schools that you're applying to. So you're never going to write a personal statement that's specific about your interest in like Loma Linda Dental School or UCSF School of Medicine, aside from applying to some type of special program. If you're applying to AMCAS or ACOMAS, the question is really why have you selected medicine or dentistry or pharmacy as your intended health profession? And they're looking for about a page to a page and a half single spaced. So just again, why this profession is generally going to be the question that you are asked to address in your personal statement. And if you want to see all of the very specific language from every health professions program with the very specific character counts, I've shared a Google Doc in the chat that will outline each application portal's, specific language on personal statements. Writing is a process. As a scientist by education, I can't necessarily say by trade, but as a scientist at kind of the undergraduate level, I definitely would want to have kind of this opportunity where I would just sit down at my computer and like stream of consciousness in one sitting my personal statement. That's from the science writing background. That's kind of what we think. Like, I've collected all my data. Now I just have to sit down and write it, and it's going to flow out beautifully. It's going to take me like an hour, and I won't have to do any editing. Well, that's not gonna be super realistic. There's actually gonna be a lot of brainstorming and writing and rewriting and editing that's going to go into this process. And you might not even start with your personal statement first. We are gonna address the personal statement first in this workshop, but you might actually start more with your extracurricular essays when you really kind of get into this process of writing. It might actually be easier to start with clubs and organizations and jobs and research and talking about kind of what you did through those experiences. That might be just an easier way to start. But you do want to think about your personal history or your family background, because that likely will make up some of your kind of how you initially became interested in medicine. That probably was something that happened to you personally or happened within your family structure. But again, you've also engaged outside the classroom in various ways: clinical, service, research, leadership, cultural orgs, Greek orgs, so on and so forth. And we're going to do some writing about those as well. Remember, there's a work and activity section. You're going to have to really think about what you envision for your future career goals. And Jen and I will talk about this in the conclusion, but it's going to be more big picture stuff. We're not necessarily looking for you to have a very narrow or specific 15-year plan where you know exactly what city or specialty you want to work in. But generally speaking, where do you see the direction from for your career, your medical education going? Any hardships or unusual obstacles that you've had to overcome in your life? That is something that, again, will make up perhaps what we call the disadvantage statement, which is that third component we talked about early on, is that personal statement, work and activities, but you also have a section which we lovingly call the disadvantage statement, which is going to outline some of those obstacles or hardships. And then lastly, if you are actually applying to a post-baccalaureate program, particularly what we call an academic record enhancer post-bac program, in that essay, you might be addressing some gaps or discrepancies in your academic record. That is the reason that you are pursuing post-baccalaureate coursework. If you have academic issues that might indicate that you're not ready to apply to medical school, that is something that we might want to address in an advising appointment and direct you more towards post-baccalaureate programs, because there's not really anything that you're going to be able to articulate too much in your personal statement that is going to address like academic metrics that are outside of the realm of competitiveness. And so sometimes I know students have a lot of challenges that have precluded them to be successful at the undergraduate level. And that happens, and that's okay. And we're here to support that. But that kind of means the student would be looking at doing some postgraduate work to raise their GPA prior to applying to the graduate or professional program. So with that, I'm going to turn the mic over for a couple minutes to Dr. Kavetsky, who's going to talk to us about crafting our story and what that looks like. So Jen, I'll turn the mic over to you.
Hey everybody, thank you, Amber. It's really helpful to think of your personal statement kind of as a story, which means, so this does not have to be like a novel that you're writing, but think of it as you want to have a clear beginning, middle, and end, right? That nice kind of narrative arc You can tell your story in chronological order. That often kind of makes it a lot easier for the reader to follow, easier for you to write. Usually what we tell people is you want to start with how you became initially interested in healthcare. As maybe you didn't realize this at the time, but looking back, you're like, oh, I guess that's when this started. One thing I do want to stress is don't feel like you have to have a moment where the heavens opened up and the angels sang and you knew, I want to be an optometrist. I mean, if you have that, great, good for you. Most people don't. But like I said, looking back, you can usually be like, oh, you know what? I guess that's kind of how I got started on this path. And then the middle and the body paragraphs are the things you've done to explore and confirm your interest. How do you know this is the right path for you, right? How you've done some things in the healthcare field to make sure, hey, this is what I want to do, right? And then your future goals, as Amber noted, can be things like that you're not expected to have a 10-year plan figured out, right? This is not supposed to be like, I'll be the youngest surgeon at UCLA's medical center by the time I'm 35. Like, don't do that. That's weird. But we do want some sense of where are you going, right? And when we say this, kind of what kind of health professional do you want to be? This does not have to be specialty. And actually for the pre-med folks, you don't want to talk about specialty. And we'll get into this a little bit more when we get to conclusions. But just really, again, where are you going? What's coming up next? A couple of things that often trip people up. So yes, you do want to think this is a story and telling a story. But this is your story, right? Again, you're not writing a Pulitzer Prize winning novel, right? This is a story about you and your experiences. And that's how you stand out, right? I know a lot of students worry, oh my God, I have to stand out. But realistically, guys, there is no situation in which they're going to read your first paragraph, put it down, and say, get Amber on the phone. We want her to be a brain surgeon. The way you stand out is by telling a story about you and why you want to do this, right? And being yourself. So don't worry as much about standing out as much as really kind of, this is who I am. This is why I want to be this health profession. And this is what I've done to make sure this is the right profession for me. And that kind of authenticity and sincerity, that will make you stand out. So your introduction. Often this is going to be a very short kind of story about you. The fancy word for this is anecdote. So, if you have to take a vocab test, there you go. About kind of how you got started, maybe an early encounter with a health professional. It can also be kind of a brief recap of your background. There's a lot of flexibility on the intro. You do want to avoid some really cliched and boring lines. So ever since I was 5, I always wanted to be a doctor. You have not always wanted to be anything. When you were a baby, you didn't know you had feet. So you couldn't have known you wanted to be a brain surgeon. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is, they know, it's in your application. You don't have that much time, so you don't want to be wasting it. And the same with the question asked me to discuss. They know, they wrote the question. This, though, if you're really struggling to get started, sometimes using these as an on-ramp, right? Like rephrasing the question or introducing yourself, that can be a good way to get started, especially if you're stuck. You just delete that before you send it in. So we've included a sample intro, and I do want to stress this is, if you guys go on the internet or check a book out of the library, like a real physical book, you're going to see the 10 best personal statements Harvard Medical School got. And that's kind of intimidating. So Amber and I really wish there was a book out there called Essays That Got the Job Done. Essays that worked. So this is an intro from a real student that successfully got them into a program that they wanted to get into. So growing up in place, oral healthcare was considered a luxury rather than a necessity. Most people expected teeth to degrade as they aged. Once I moved to the US, I realized that visiting the dentist was critical to maintaining proper overall health. Unfortunately, as immigrants, my family could not afford dental care until my father was able to maintain a stable job where dental insurance was a reasonable expense. When I finally was able to see my first dentist and later get braces and have emergency oral surgery, my interest in the field of dentistry began. So we picked this example for a couple reasons. One is, this is not the heavens opened up and they knew they wanted to be a dentist, right? This is over time. This is not the most amazing introduction I've ever read, but it's solid, right? I have a sense of who this person is. I have a sense of why they want to be a dentist, and I want to see what's coming up next, right? This is not going to be, going to set the world on fire, but it worked and it got this person into the program that they wanted to get into. We also want to stress, this is not a template. You do not have to write an introduction that begins with growing up in Chino Hills, right? There's lots of ways to start. This is a way someone chose, but the reason we picked this one is we wanted to kind of show that you can have a relatively simple, straightforward introduction, right? You don't have to begin with like, I could hear the bone break across the, that's weird, don't do that, right? You can just kind of get started into what has sparked your interest in this field, right? You don't have to do anything crazy.
Before we move into body paragraphs, part of identifying your body paragraph and how those are going to flow is really identifying your themology. And again, as scientists, sometimes themes can be an uncomfortable word. Maybe it's too much on the writing spectrum for you, but probably you already have a theme and you just didn't know what that would be called. For many students who are going to be applying to the UCR School of Medicine through their special programming, you may have already heard from their panelists the real big focus on kind of health education or prevention of chronic illnesses. Sometimes that's referred to as like community health, and really what that is addressing is lifestyle management, lifestyle choices, and how what we choose to put in our bodies or do with our bodies is going to be affecting our chronic illness prevention. And so many students at UC Riverside who either have come from underserved communities themselves or now have been in the Riverside, San Bernardino County area for maybe 4 or more years have probably developed a pretty intimate knowledge of this idea of kind of lifestyle management or community health. Sometimes it's referred to the importance of health education or prevention of chronic illnesses or culturally competent care. Those are themes. And you may not have known that. And that might be the guiding force for a lot of your body paragraphs or a lot of the main kind of spirit or philosophy of your personal statement. Other students are actually more interested in the more biological or genetic side of medicine. So more of, I guess, the ologies, you can kind of think of them, where we're doing more specialty care. You're getting into cardiology, neurology, again, all the kind of ologies that are outside of primary and preventative care. Perhaps thinking about innovation in the field of medicine as a whole through research, or maybe pursuing academic medicine, which would be a teaching faculty at a medical school. And some students might not be pre-med and they might be more interested in like physical therapy, which tends to talk a lot about pain reduction, mobility, and increased independence throughout our mostly senior years, but certainly mobility and independence can affect any generation. Some people, like dentists or optometrists, might want to discuss long-term and ongoing relationships with patients. Oftentimes, pharmacists might address accessibility in their essay because pharmacists are really the only healthcare provider in which you can walk into a retail establishment and talk to a pharmacist immediately. And so they're a very accessible member of the healthcare team. And some of you may be scanning this entire page and really feeling like every one of these themes resonates with you. And that's probably common. Most of you are probably really feeling a visceral reaction in a positive way from all of these types of themes. Well, the only problem with that is you don't have 15 pages or 20 pages or even 5 pages to discuss what your why is for pursuing medicine and connecting that to your personal story and your extracurriculars. You only have a page to a page and a half, single spaced, to articulate how you initially became interested in medicine, how you've explored and confirmed your interest in medicine or health profession, and your career trajectory moving forward. You only have a page to a page and a half to articulate that. And so really one or two of these themes is going to need to boil to the surface as your kind of most important reason for pursuing your intended health profession. And that themology will hopefully help guide you into your body paragraphs, which is where you're going to be more focused on kind of some of your clinical exploration. So in your body paragraphs, which for an application that's a page and a half, a personal statement that's a page and a half, you'll likely have probably 3 body paragraphs is really all you might have space for. And again, these body paragraphs, that focuses that exploration and confirmation process, which tends to be clinical in nature. Now, it doesn't have to be only clinical, but when you are trying to articulate why you want to be a physician and how you know you want to be a physician or a pharmacist or a dentist, most likely it will be clinical experiences where you have interacted with both patients and providers in your community setting that's allowed you to confirm that that's what you want to do. There might be some opportunity to talk about some mentorship programs or some teaching and tutoring programs, particularly if that's central to your theme. Perhaps health education is your theme and you've also been an ARC tutor. Well, then being a tutor or an SI leader is definitely going to fit into this idea of being a health educator. But generally, I would say 2 of the 3 experiences, or maybe 3 of the 3 experiences that make up those 3 body paragraphs, tend to be clinical in nature. So Jen's going to take us through the rest of this slide.
Yeah. And one thing too, when you're thinking about your theme, is it can be, especially at first, it can be daunting because it can be hard to really articulate why it is you like this, right? So we have the example here. I want to become a doctor because I want to help people. That's great. You should definitely want to help people if you're going to be a doctor, right? The thing is, that's kind of the basis, right? So I have a PhD in English. I like reading. Right? If I didn't like reading, I probably should not have gotten a degree where I'd have to read literally hundreds of books. And there's lots of other fields that help people, and that nobody bleeds on you, right? Amber and I both help people, and generally speaking, there is no blood. So in my case, my husband is a lawyer. Lawyers also like to read. And, we go to lawyer parties and they're like, well, if you like to read, why didn't you become a lawyer and make lots of money? And I can't say, well, I can't say to my husband's boss, well, but you read boring stuff and I don't want to. I want to read books about robots. So what I realized in these conversations is what I like about reading is I love meeting new people because people are so interesting. Them and their stories are just endlessly interesting. And books let me do that. I can meet all sorts of different people from all sorts of places and times, people I could never meet normally. And that's why I like books. Right? There's other reasons people like books, but that one's kind of mine. And it took a lot of lawyer parties for me to figure that out. So you're not going to have it necessarily right off the bat. Maybe you do, maybe that slide, you saw it, but probably this is something you're going to, as you're working on your essays, you're going to be like, you know what? I keep coming back to this theme of health education. I keep coming back to this theme of closing health disparities, right? I keep coming back to this theme of you being a culturally competent physician, right? That it'll kind of come as you come out. The other thing that's important here is you don't want to just say what something is. You want to get at the why, right? Why do you want to help people? There's lots of jobs that help people. Why do you want to do them? How do you want to help people, right? And why is this the best way? You also want to use what we like to call generally specific examples, which I know is not a super helpful term, so let me define. You don't want to just say, I volunteered at the Riverside Free Clinic, because like, cool, right? That doesn't say anything. And I saw stuff. Like, that's too general. But you don't, in these essays, you really don't have time to be like, I remember Mr. Smith. It was a Tuesday in April, and he had a paper cut on his finger, right? You don't have time for that. So what you want to do is try to end up in the middle. So probably that story you're going to tell me about Mr. Smith is going to have something in common. You're going to have seen lots of patients who can say, you know, as I volunteered at the Riverside Free Clinic, I saw a lot of people come in who were worried about affording treatment, right? And so we worked to come up with like affordable treatment options. So it's still specific to you and your experience, but it's on a slightly kind of more general level, right? So it's in that middle. It's general, but it's still specific. It's not just like, I volunteered at the clinic, right? Because like I could volunteer at the clinic. They'd probably let me give people clipboards, but I don't even know first aid. So they wouldn't let me do anything more than like hand clipboards out. So being specific to you and your experiences helps show that like, you know, you've explored and confirmed your interest. But yeah, you don't want to try to be nearly as like, I remember this specific patient and this specific time, because you don't have room. Conclusion. All right, this is kind of very broadly, where are you going and what are your goals? You want to avoid sweeping generalizations like, I'm going to cure everyone. You can't. An example I like to use, I am extremely nearsighted because my eyes are the wrong shape. My doctor can treat it. He can help me manage it. He cannot fix it. My eyeballs are just wrong. It's just the way they are. Same with, I'm going to give everyone free healthcare. Like, by yourself, no. Bernie Sanders couldn't do it. None of us are going to do it by ourselves either, right? Bernie Sanders couldn't do it by himself. Even if he was president, he'd still need Congress, right? So you don't want to go that big. But what you can do in your conclusion is talk about maybe particular interests. So research, primary care, underserved communities. You generally don't want to get into a specialty because, especially for the pre-meds, you don't know where your, I just forgot the residency. You don't know what area your residency is going to be in. So if you say, I am set on surgery, they're going to be like, does this person not know how it works, right? So those of you who are doing like dental and optometry, you can talk a little bit more about, you know, I'm kind of interested in a little bit more specific, but you still don't want to be like, I am going to specialize in retinal reattachment. That's still too specific. So generally kind of the areas you're interested in, and this is also a good place to kind of, what are the qualities? What kind of physician do you want to be, right? Do you want to be one who advocates? Do you want to be one who educates? Maybe it's really important to you, what you've really been impressed with is even when doctors can't fix it, they can be empathetic and compassionate, and that's what you want to do, right? Believe me, my eye doctor can't fix my eyes, but if he just blew me off, that would upset me, right? Like I want him to at least like have compassion for me and my extreme nearsightedness. So much like the intro, we have a sample conclusion. Again, this is kind of one that worked. So as an inspiring physician, passionate about serving those from underserved backgrounds, I believe that healthcare goes beyond providing the proper diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment. It is important for physicians to provide necessary preventative education, be an advocate for their patients' health, and treat patients with empathy, which are qualities that I'm confident I will embody as a primary care physician. This is only 2 sentences long. It's actually quite short. Often the conclusions for these are quite short. And it's just, doesn't need to be long. Again, this conclusion just kind of wraps it up. The other thing I tell people to remember is at this point in your essay, you have either convinced the reader or you haven't, right? There's very little you can do in these next few sentences that is going to be like, well, I was on the fence with this person, but man, that second word from the end, let's let them in. It's like in gymnastics, you know, when they do all those cool twists and flips, and crazy stuff in the air, and then they just have to like stick the landing and not fall over. That's what we're going for here, right? You just have to be normal for like 2 more sentences. Just stick the landing. And the conclusion sometimes is the wheels come off the wagon, right? We'll see 2 sentences are fine. The third sentence is like, I know my grades aren't great, but if you just let me in, I'll be so great. Like, no, don't do that. Or like, and in conclusion, my cats love me and think I'd be a great doctor. Like, don't do that, right? Just be normal for 2 more sentences. And it can be something as simple as what you're seeing, right? This conclusion, again, it's not the world's greatest conclusion, but it sticks the landing, right?
It's generally specific, I think, is even a good way to think
Yes.
about this. You've gotten some really specific ways that this person plans to support their patients, but not so narrow that it is like really kind of pigeonholing what their future career looks like. Um, so the only other thing I would want to add to this is if you do really feel like indicating a specialty is important for you or necessary in your conclusion, then that kind of takes us back to that theme page and perhaps that level of specialty care. If it's so important to you that you need to say, in my conclusion, I need to be an ophthalmologist or a neurologist, then that really means your entire personal statement needs to be about how you've explored and confirmed your interest in ophthalmology or neurology or whatever the ology is. So we would expect to see some really focused extracurricular experiences, particularly with people in those medical specialties. Like I've shadowed an ophthalmologist, I've volunteered with retinal detachment patients, I volunteered with the Braille Society and supported patients with vision impairments, right? If it's something that's important to you to show up in your conclusion, then that kind of identifies it to be your themology all the way. Most of our students take more of a general theme, like doing primary care or health education with underserved communities or the qualities that you may want to embody. That's more of the normal thing that Jennifer and I see with UCR students who are writing these applications. But remember, this is a national applicant pool, and there are absolutely people applying to medicine that will discuss their interest specific in cardiology and all of the different extracurricular experiences they've done with heart patients. But we find, again, this format to be more practical. As I mentioned with our disclaimer moving forward from our introduction, that we take a very practical approach of what was the spark that lit your match? How did you explore and confirm your interests? And then generally speaking, what do you see for your future moving forward? So hopefully that 3-part framework will help you put pen to paper proverbially. But as I said early on in the presentation, it's actually probably not the first thing you're going to write. If you haven't been practicing your writing in the recent months or years, it's kind of like somebody like me who doesn't run ever, unless I absolutely had to run. That's the only reason I'm running. And then somebody's like, hey, go run a marathon, right? Daunting task. Normally you like want to start with like a 5K, right? Let's start off with a warm-up mile before we try to run a marathon. And this work and activity section, I think, is a very practical way to warm up your writing juices, so to speak. AMCAS, which is the MD application, has the most expansive or extensive work and activity section. You can put 15 entries into most applications. Some of them, like dentistry, are actually unlimited. You can put as much as you want. For pretty much all applications, you have about 600 to 700 characters for your extracurricular experience. So 700 characters is about a paragraph. I know you guys are probably much more used to word counts, but these applications don't use word counts, they use character counts. So I'm just trying to share with you the language that the committees use. 700 characters, Jen can correct me, but I'm guessing it's about 250 words. That's about the length of a paragraph. So you'll get basically one paragraph per extracurricular activity. And in that paragraph, we generally like to see these three things addressed. Again, this is Jennifer and I's recommendations. Different advisors may give different ideas, but we like to have some context about what the organization or program is, because this is, again, a national application. Now, if you're applying just to the UCR School of Medicine, they probably already know what Mini Medical School and Riverside Free Clinic are. So perhaps that wouldn't be that big of a deal, but 98% of my students are going to be applying through a national centralized application to schools all over the country. And schools not in California might not even know what UCR is. You may have to explain that that's Riverside and not the University of Colorado something, because there's also UC Denver and UC Boulder. So you're going to have to give some examples, or I'm sorry, explanation of like, well, what is Riverside Free Clinic, or what is Mini Medical School, or what is a Cope Health Scholar, because not everybody's going to know what that means. You're also going to want to give a sense of your roles and responsibilities, because again, positions are variable. Even EMT came up with some of my ambassadors in our meeting on Monday, and I think it was a really, really great example, because seemingly you would say, well, doesn't everybody know what an EMT is or what an EMT does? And I think anybody in the medical community will have a baseline sense of what an emergency medical technician is and their general roles and responsibilities. But that actually can be variable across counties, across states, and even across employers. And so some students are doing BLS, some students are doing ALS, some people are working as ER techs or working in nursing homes. So you can't just say, oh, I'm an EMT, and expect everybody to know exactly what it means that you did in your job as an EMT, but you definitely want to take that space to share some of your roles and responsibilities. So about a paragraph on the program, a sentence on the program, a sentence on your roles and responsibilities, and then probably more importantly, a sentence or two about your takeaways. Like, what did you learn, gain, or develop from your participation in this organization or program? It might be a tangible skill set like leadership skills or communication skills or problem solving skills. It may be more of a personal competency like time management or resiliency or adaptability, or it might be kind of a bigger global way of thinking. Like, I learned about social determinants of health and how diet and nutrition can affect chronic illnesses, or I learned that like access to healthcare is a humongous issue in this country or in this county, and not everybody has access to quality health insurance that's affordable. So there's a lot of ways to kind of dissect what we learned or gained or developed through our programs, but this type of resume information would be helpful to include in a narrative format. So the expectation on these applications is for your 250 words or your 700 characters, you're writing a paragraph. It's not a bullet point in the same way that a resume would, but it does include philosophically a lot of the same information that we would expect to see in a resume. As I said early on, AMCAS takes things a little bit further, and they have something called most meaningful experiences. In the AMCAS application, you get to pick 3 of your 15 experiences that are most meaningful, and you'll have an additional 1,325 characters, including spaces, which is about 6 sentences, to discuss the meaning of that experience. It's somewhat difficult to explain without really showing you, but there's actually 2 different boxes in the AMCAS application, kind of the top box will be your 700 characters of your initial description. And then there'll be a second box that pops up below that if you select an org as your most meaningful, where your additional kind of 1325 will come in. So it is 2000 characters, but it's 700 and then 1325. When you're doing your most meaningfuls, it tends to be what the org or program is and what you did, or your roles and responsibilities is what goes up into the top 700 characters. And then what you learned, gained, or developed is generally what then comprises the 1325 most meaningful characters. That makes sense what I said, Jennifer?
I did want to additionally stress that what you learn, gain, and develop does not have to be medical or health, right? Amber already kind of spoke about the other things that you can gain from that. Yeah, maybe you work part-time at Target and you've learned customer service, you've learned how to think on your feet, you've learned problem solving. Those are all great things to learn, gain, and develop. So don't feel like, and in conclusion, I learned that doctors have to listen, right? Like if it has a medical connection or a health connection, awesome, you can make that, but don't feel like you have to force it.
The work and activities section, the expectation is that you include things from college or after. If you're an alumni, things that come after college is certainly applicable. If you're still a college student, then in the work and activities section, we kind of focus in just on the things you've done during college. But in your personal statement, things that occurred in your K through 12 years are totally fair game for your personal statement. So lastly, we just want to move into the disadvantage statement. And as I kind of alluded to early on, Jen and I don't super love the word disadvantage statement. I think it kind of sets up like a negative connotation for this essay when it's really not seen as a negative thing. It's not intended to be negative in any way. It's just intended to be context for your lived experience. It's meant for you to address any hardships or challenges that you've had to encounter, possibly largely in your K through 12 years, that haven't been articulated anywhere else in your application. Yes, this may overlap or intersect with your introductory paragraph, but it is somewhat different than your why medicine essay because you're really just focusing in on hardships. You're not necessarily connecting those hardships to your interest or aptitude for medicine. You're just giving the committee an opportunity to better understand what your lived experience has looked like. As I said, we generally at this point are looking for your K through 12 or what we call your formative years. And that might be reassuring to those of you who feel like things are good now or they're much better now, but perhaps when you were 8, they weren't. Those are really the kind of years that we want or need to know about. Those years in our lives are really formative for the foundations that we build through high school and college and beyond. But these are going to be factors kind of in the middle that Jen and I see on a really regular basis. So we are very often encountering students who are first generation American, or even perhaps an immigrant to the United States. So if you were not born in the United States, then we would classify you as an immigrant status. But if you were born in the US and your parents were not, then we would classify that as a first generation American. A first generation college student, which would be if your parents went to school in the US or not. So a lot of students that I work with had a family structure similar to mine where their parents didn't have higher education or maybe even completed high school education. But then I have a few students whose parents do technically have higher education, but it was awarded from a different country and didn't translate or transfer over to the US. I have a lot of students where their mom was a pharmacist or a physician in like Taiwan, but now working in the US is working at what we call like a blue collar job because her education didn't transfer or translate. That would be helpful to share with an admissions committee, right? The context of that. Many of my students, their first language is something other than English, and their primary language spoken at home is something other than English. And that would be helpful information to share with an admissions committee about your lived experience. Parental education, occupation, and income might kind of go together as like a little constellation of things that, again, may or may not be relevant. Growing up in a single parent household isn't necessarily, we're not necessarily referring to like, well, my parents got divorced when I was a senior in high school. Unfortunately, that is really common. We're talking more about like my entire life, I've grown up in a single parent or single income household. Maybe I don't know who one of my parents is, or one of my parents is in the incarceration system. Communal living indicates multiple families living under the same residence, or maybe coming and going from the same residence. That's kind of a unique or different lived experience. Where you grew up, certainly being in the Inland Empire or the Central Valley, is going to be a more underserved area than San Francisco, Orange County, LA, or San Francisco. Of course, there's different parts of the country as well that you may all hail from, but certainly the central part of California is very different than the coastal part of California. Having jobs, having to work in high school, or having to work through college to help mitigate the cost of education, these are all things that are regular or common for Jennifer and I to see, and commonality doesn't disclude disadvantage statement. Just because a lot of UCR students may identify with these certain factors doesn't mean you shouldn't be writing a disadvantage statement. It just means that you all should be writing a disadvantage statement, and you should be taking the time to share the facts of your life and your story without feeling the need to justify any of it. You're just sharing the realities of your lived experience. And these types of things are also much expanded upon in the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera categories. Yes, absolutely. If you've encountered homelessness or abuse, assault, neglect, a violent crime, you grew up in a hoarding condition, you know, if you have something very significant and very traumatic, you probably already know that, and you've decided if you want to write about it or you don't want to write about it. And Jennifer and I are absolutely going to be here to help with that. But if you also are identifying with the things that I have written on the screen, and maybe weren't really aware that that would be categorically applicable to write about in a disadvantage statement, this may be a new moment for you, and you may marinate on that, and perhaps we circle back around to some questions or concerns that you may have about this section during the Q&A. Is there anything you would want to add to this, Jen?
Yeah, a couple of quick things. So sometimes students, they're like, well, yeah, my parents are immigrants, and you know, English was a struggle, but like we weren't homeless. And I'm like, okay, it's not the oppression Olympics, right? Just because like somebody else had it worse doesn't mean that the things were great. And the other thing Amber and I see a lot, and this is why we wish it wasn't called disadvantage statement, because many people are like, my parents are not a disadvantage, right? My community is not a disadvantage. And that's why we wish it wasn't called that. So I really like when Amber kind of talks about like, it wasn't ideal, right? It's not ideal if you have to translate for your parent, you know, parent-teacher conference for your parents. And if you look too at the sample, the other thing people worry about is telling a sob story. If you look at the sample, this is not a sob story. This is just an explanation, right? And this gives us a better sense of this person and where they come from and kind of who they are, right? And it's worth talking about.
And when these types of things are coupled with academically a strong application, it's just going to be added value. When a medical school can say, you know, Sally has been through all of these different life challenges and maintained a 3.6, 3.7 GPA, they clearly know that you're resilient and adaptable and hardworking. There's a lot of skill sets that are derived from the fact that you've encountered hardships, but have still been able to be academically and professionally successful. Where some of this falls flat is when a student might be thinking like, well, I have a 2.5, but I've had some really significant life challenges. You know, that's unfortunate because unfortunately life can have a negative impact on our grades, but the fact that the GPA wouldn't be competitive for the professional program is probably more of what the issue will be at that time. So this disadvantage statement, it's really carrying a lot of weight because ideally it's coupled with academically a strong and competitive application. So I just want to end with a couple resources to assist you with the writing process. So there are some additional resources, both for free and low cost, that you can take a look at here. And I will leave up our contact information as I'm sending around a couple extra resources in the chat. If you want to go ahead and let the audience know, Jennifer, who you can serve and how you can serve them. I wasn't able to address that at the beginning. So if you could share that, that information now would be helpful.
Because of how my program is funded, I'm not able to work with alumni. We can only work with current UCR undergraduates. HPAC is different. They are able to work with alumni. The other thing is, so I book up even faster than Amber and Charlie do. So if you are planning to apply, you definitely want to make an appointment ahead of time. So, and even further ahead for me, because I'm just one person. And I work with all students. So not everybody is a health profession student. So you're competing with all the other UCR undergrads.
For HPAC, that's our Google phone number. So you can call, text. Yeah, call or text, and then our email, where you can email, and then our website. And we have all of our social media platforms down there at the bottom. A recording of this session can be found on our YouTube channel, which I have also included for you all in the chat.